Hello all, and today we are going to discuss Thucydides and his history of the Peloponnesian War, which of course is a massively influential text as we get into. Now I want to start off, of course, with his predecessors and really his ambitions and his historical endeavors. Now, one of the figures that in contemporary times that he is going to be massively influenced by is Pericles, who is considered the leader of Greece during the Golden Age, and as well as the contributions that we've been tracing now for the last few videos of the likes of Anaxagoras, who helped establish the idea of these secular physics that we discussed last time with Hippocrates, where instead of the mythological accounts of who or what is causing phenomena in the world, we now have the understanding through science of physical properties and their causal relationships, which strips away the mythical explanation in the earlier Greeks. Now, he is highly educated as well as having this new scientific revolution happening before him with the sophists. And of course, with the sophists, you have the use of rhetoric, of maybe not necessarily finding the exact truth of matters, but to implore rhetoric to persuade other people. And this ties into the idea of a real politic, which undermines the mythological accounts of law and justice. And an example of this, as we'll get when we get to Plato, is Protagoras and the Platonic dialogues. And so Thucydides, using that sophist education, is going to borrow the idea of going away from the divine accounts of societal origins. For Thucydides, he wants to have a real political understanding of not just what has given to a society, but what actually pulls apart social cohesion. And so Thucydides, in using this new scientific revolution given to us by Thales and Anaximander and Anaxagoras, as well as Anaximenes, this is going to play a key part in the social sciences for the demythological process that we've talked about, where we saw with Hippocrates in medicine of epidemics no longer having the idea of Apollo causing epidemics with his arrows to cause sickness, but the understanding of diet, the understanding of wind shear and location as more of the causal explanation for phenomena. So Thucydides is applying this new secular revolution of causality in summation to the human self-consciousness. And in doing so, he wants to implore on actual hard evidence for political purposes to understand how societies break apart through these challenges, through these skirmishes, such as the plague, as we'll get into, such as the Peloponnesian War itself, or the democratic process or its shortfalls with the likes of Pericles, who is a great leader, but ultimately, he loses power briefly and then, gets it back because the Athenians are rather undecisive. They, flip and kind of, weave on public opinion. And perhaps this is somewhat to say that the sophist teachings is going to play a part in how unstable really the democratic process is for ancient Greece at the time. The premise here for the Peloponnesian War is to create a human science and the study of human things, and his ambition really is tasked with that understanding and use of self-consciousness in the actual world itself, and how, as he points out in the early part of this text, he wants to give a historical account that anyone can find value from. It's just not just something to be read by his people in his time. He wants something that's more timeless, and he believes that in a cyclical way, when these same pressures, such as war or an epidemic, happens, the potential outcomes are roughly the same. And so Thucydides himself lived for the full duration of the Peloponnesian War of about 460 to 400 BC. Now, the war itself is, of course, of Sparta and Athens as a war for the hearts and minds of Greece, really, from 431 to 404 BC. So Thucydides himself, of course, was a participant in this war. He is an Athenian general, and one of, I think, the artistic expressions that you'll see that makes it rather unique compared to contemporary history, that how we write today, is that this is written in a first-person context. And so, he's writing about other figures, and where he doesn't necessarily have concrete evidence or an account for what the happenings actually are in a matter-of-fact way. He will, fess up to this. He doesn't just, create narratives out of this. He might, once in a while, implore using that sophist education to, give dialogue. He very much in his methodology wants to actually find hard evidence of actually interviewing people or knowing them well enough to sort of connect the dots, if you will, to the actual events and people that he wants to discuss. And so despite writing in first person, he wants to be very objective in how this text is going to be perceived in his historical account, because he wants this to be accessible as a text about human nature itself for all time, and all of these different challenges that keep rearing its head throughout the last millennium, really. And so Thucydides rebukes, and he's not much of a fan of the Homeric tradition and the mythical role models or ideals that they purport to. The sophists rejected the mythical accounts of virtue or divine explanation, and more towards that real politic. And so a sophist understanding is one of perspective of these differing accounts, instead of just simply having one unified answer for causality, if you will. And so his use of speech and rhetoric is going to be very pivotal if you want to look at this text. For the sophists, of course, they give arguments to persuade the Athenian democracy that they're living under. And so Thucydides has mastered really this form and wants to apply that rhetoric into representing his historical truth here. But to go back to really his critiques of Homer, Thucydides wants Greek to have a much different framework insofar as education being the new way, or a different form of education as compared to the Homeric way. Instead of using the likes of poetry or imagination, Thucydides favors empiricism. And again, we see, as we're tracking here on this project, that Greek culture is now moving past the ones of myth to the ones like with Plato, of trying to compile evidence, understanding the forms, etc. Thucydides believes in a cause and effect relationship similar to Hippocrates, who of course was influential for this text, to have a rational account of the human subjectivity, really. Now, his big predecessor in this historical project is Herodotus, who's considered the father of history. And Herodotus, really, in his historical account, was much less based in this empirical idea and much more towards that Homeric idea of, using the muses, of having something of a sort of mythological inspiration that is given to him as opposed to where Thucydides wants to strive for more of an evidence base. Now, the model, if you will, really of these dialogues that Thucydides creates using not just the scientific method, but also an artistic method of creating these dialogues. He starts with a thesis and an antithesis to any given political matter that is happening in Greek culture. Thucydides, of course, is still going to incorporate the likes of epic style and poetry, but he's also going to mesh together the idea of Greek tragedy with the use of declaring that his historical happenings are the most important in history. So there are still elements. Thucydides, again, even though he wants to use science, he wants to be empirical about these matters, he still uses art. He still very much is indebted to the idea of using a poetic style that you don't really see in contemporary historical accounts. And his prose is, of course, out of this world, really. That's what I think is part of what makes this text so unique and so influential. And so I want to discuss the tragedy aspect. Now, tragedy, of course, for the Greeks is, good things, a good quality human being, if you will, that are weighed down ultimately by certain aspects that really overruns or diminishes the good or the potential, really, that person can bring, but is again righted in the end. And you see this with Sophocles in his tragedies, and Thucydides wants to create a sort of macrocosm understanding of this in a limitation of society or conscious man. He doesn't think that, when it comes to these dire events, that we're going to talk about, justice or the truth, as it were. We're going to be much more practical. We're going to want to survive, if you will. And so Thucydides, the great achievement really here is how he manages to kind of bring together all of these different ideas and literary forms that his predecessors and even his contemporaries, with the likes of science and this new causal understanding of physics, to bring together with an artistic prose and tragedy that makes this a real masterpiece. Now, we're going to look at the history itself now, and I'm going to go around in some of the different books here. In Book 5, Thucydides talks about his role in the war, but interesting enough, even though I just mentioned that he gives a first-hand account in prose in the way he writes this, from this perspective, in this particular volume, he actually talks about himself in a sort of third person, where he's routed by Sparta ultimately, and the Athenians are so disappointed in him that they put Thucydides in exile away from the Athenian empire. And I believe that this exile is something like 20 years long, and this gives him, fortunately for us, a lot of time for Thucydides to be able to think about these kinds of matters, to be able to work on his objectivity and account for the historical happenings of not just what's going to happen to Athens, but what happened to himself, quite literally. Now, the first book is considered the archaeology of war, which goes back to the earliest conflicts that we know of ancient Greece. And so he's going to use that sophist education again to create speeches out of these events. And Thucydides then explains in the Peloponnesian War what the so-called what is on the surface, if you will, of why this war is taking place. It is really matters of territory. But he actually believes that in the end, the reason why this war happened, it was inevitable. The given reasons is the broken treaty between Sparta and Athens because of those disputes of territories. But what this is ultimately really about, and what was going to rear its head in the end to cause this war, and he kind of shows here that he believes it was an inevitable conflict. If it wasn't just for one territory, it would have been for something else, and this treaty was doomed to fail because Athens was becoming more powerful. As the Persian Wars ended, the Athenians had developed a very formidable sea power and navy, and in using that through the duration of the Persian Wars, they develop a very formidable commerce and overall wealth, which of course, when you have commerce and wealth and a dominant strand of military competence here with the Navy, you begin to gain influence. And this concerned the Spartans because now you have a new upstart developing around you. And meanwhile, Sparta was on somewhat of a decline. They're starting to lose their influence. And so Thucydides believes the inevitable conflict is coming because of how much ground Athenia had made during the Persian Wars and its success. And so when he talks about the early battles, he talks about the four figures, and he's really ahead of his time in understanding of the likes of crowd psychology and how he does talk about these figures. He definitely somewhat uses that poetic prose towards leadership, and he kind of has a clear distinction to offer up on who he really thinks the villains and heroes are. So yes, in a certain sense, he is very objective in how he wants to describe these events, but again, in using art, really, he definitely has a narrative that he wants to craft using that sophist education again. And of course, his great example of a hero of great leadership is Pericles, and he's highly admired here as the good man and model citizen, really, for democratic Athens. And this leads, of course, to one of the most famous speeches in the entire, if not the most famous speech, which is Pericles' funeral oration in Book 2. And to summarize in Book 2, Pericles talks about the importance of the individual citizen to, really make the most out of the democratic process, and what the expectations and possibilities really are for what it means to be an Athenian people. And so Pericles talks of the objectives over the duration of the Peloponnesian War, which is largely to be defensive. There's no need to be offensive, and if we're offered peace, we should take it. He's not trying to conquest against Sparta. He simply wants to defend Athens. And, if there's ever any time where it seems that we have the upper hand, then of course we need to strike in this conflict. But if there is a reason to believe that Sparta will come to the table for peace, then we should do so. And so it's a conflict when necessary sort of idea here. And then Thucydides is going to talk about another great strain on civilization, which is the well-being, the health of the citizens, and the idea of the plague that ravages Athens at the time. And he actually, again, is able to give a first-person account, just as he did with the war as a general, because he contracted the plague itself. And so it kind of dips into Hippocrates and his work, where he just simply describes what the plague felt like to have, what the symptoms were. We'll notice as we're going through these volumes here that Thucydides, when he discusses the plague, when he's discussing the war, he cares about the matter of facts of the phenomena that's happening. He's not interested in Apollo or Zeus bringing revenge onto people, and we must pray and do the rituals right again if we want to get out of this. He is simply discussing the social application of the plague, the causes of what is going to take away the fragility of the cohesion when faced with disaster in a sort of macrocosm. And then moving to book 3, which is very important, which is the revolt of Attila and the Athenian upheaval against Athens. And so this angers, of course, the Athenians, because this is a show of weakness to have a revolt happening. And so they go there to conquer them, and in the democratic process, they vote to kill all of them under the democratic system that Cleon is now leading. And this kind of shows, at least for Thucydides and how he describes it, how ruthless the people in Athens are when having a sort of democratic say. They want to kill everyone involved regardless of their role. And certainly when you have a revolt, it's not like every single citizen that is a part of this is to be blamed. There's probably many of them who were still loyal or had apprehensions, but nonetheless they voted to murder and have a genocide of them all. And so the execution fleet is sent off. However, the next day, and this kind of shows the Thucydidean idea of how unstable democracy is for him, that in simply one sunset they decide that they felt too guilty about the idea of genociding an entire people. And so they send in a second fleet to stop the original fleet that is given the orders to kill all of Mytilene. And the speeches that he talks about, or the dialogue we have with Cleon, who wants to show authority in a very brutish way and bloodthirsty way against Diodotus, who even though he's from the side of let's not exterminate all of these people, that it's not necessary to be egalitarian about the ideas of everyone has a equal say in this revolt here. He simply has a practical argument. He just says that the idea of having a genocide here, it's the juice isn't worth the squeeze, if you will. And so he convinces the Athenians against it. Now, luckily for Mytilene, they get there in time, the second ship, because of course they're trying to stop the first ship, so they have that extra will, I would assume. And so they barely cut off that first fleet and avoid a genocide here. But for Thucydides, he's trying to show that, even in this dialogue where they decided to go against a genocide, it was only in matters of realpolitik. It had nothing to do with the Platonic forms or the ideals of justice. It simply was a matter of whether or not we had the manpower or the will to do this genocide, and had very little to do with truth or what was right. And that is one of the big themes for Thucydides here, is it's about realpolitik. It's not about the forms. And so Thucydides is also taking aim, of course, at democracy, which is very unstable and lackadaisical, with something as heavy-handed as genocide. It is simply just something that's, turning about on, again, just one evening of thinking about it. And so this really applies to the macrocosm of the fatal tragedy. Again, he uses Greek tragedy here, and in the grand scheme, in the macrocosm for Athens, this is ultimately what's going to cause their downfall, because the Athenians are very much of an innovator, of a people that value freedom, that will see change and innovation as a good, and nonetheless so they find themselves in predicaments from the same virtues that ultimately made Athens great is also going to be what's going to lead to its downfall over the course of this war. And so Athens, in the end, does lose this war. And this is ultimately a tragic cause because of the aspirations and virtues of Greek culture and its own eternal issues is what brings its downfall here in the Peloponnesian War. And then he discusses the Corcyra revolution. And so you have a very unstable city-state here, which has devolved into factions, and they're ultimately so torn ideologically, if you will, that there are no moderates left. All of the reasonable people between the populace and the oligarchs have taken a side because they just simply believe that there's no other way to answer this. It's very much you have to pick one faction or the other. You can't have peace between the oligarchs and the populace, and so all of the moderates, at least ideologically, are wiped out because they cannot live, and the society is ultimately destroyed by the populist Democrats and the oligarchs. And so Thucydides is pointing this out because logos that we talked about in leaving the mythological account, we are now a people of reason, of the word, the sophist word, if you will, of rationality. This is ultimately a shifting sand, and this is representative of Greek culture as a whole, as they pivoted away from the divine or the much more stringent mythic structure that had very little leeway of moving, and that's why it sustained itself for so long. But in secular science and this new scientific revolution and new understanding, rationality shifts all the time. And this is a main theme in his historical writing, that pointing out that under stress, rationality, of course, will shift and weave to ultimately the means and ends of realpolitik, of what is ultimately needed to survive. And so this revolution is an example, again, of how rationality and its virtue and its upholding is actually what's going to lead to its own downfall, as being the hearken of what the foundation of excellence that not just destroys Corcyra, but all of Athens in the end. And so we have a dilemma here where logos alone and reason isn't sufficient to fill the void because of all the deaths of the myths, the great Homeric myths that rise and now fall into the wayside because of the logos. And so this revolution is highly influential for what's to come, with the ideas of realpolitik as the assertion of the greatest brawn or the greater will in nature. And this is ultimately, for Thucydides, the only praxis that matters. And so, of course, this is going to be very influential for the likes of Machiavelli and Hobbes, who are going to take this up in spades. And then I want to discuss in the end the Milos dialogue, which again is another great example here of that realpolitik of social science, as we conclude here. So you have the small island of Milos, which breaks off in a revolt against Athenia. And so, of course, this again upsets Athens. And so they send out an army to bring them back into the empire. And so Thucydides gives a very beautiful and concise dialogue between the Athenian ambassadors and the rulers of Milos. In the Melian dialogue, Athens is very much in the understanding of realpolitik here, of you can either surrender or rejoin the empire, and if you don't, then we're just going to kill everyone here. And the Melians kind of represent the Platonic. They start talking about justice and the truth, and they have a sort of dialogue about what it really means to break off, and this is to no avail. The Athenians are not interested in justice or the truth. They simply want to bring back this small island to exert their power and to not show weakness on the grander social scale. And in the end, because there was really no option for the Melians, they decide not to surrender and that they will fight for their justice and truth. And the Athenians just turn around and just rout them. They just slaughter and kill everyone to the point where they are extinct. All the Melians are wiped out. And so, again, this is just another historical example of the theme here, that this is the real world. This is real politic. That's really what I think the skeleton key is for the history of the Peloponnesian War for Thucydides. Is, yes, it is hugely influential. This is considered to be the invention of how we see history and do history now, even though it has many qualities to it that we don't see today now. But he is, however, considered the father, unlike with Herodotus, who is the father of history here. He is very much the first social scientist, I think, to say, because when we're faced with these dire circumstances, when it really comes down to the survival of a civilization, only realpolitik is the option. And so Thucydides shows us the danger of social issues and how upheaval happens, and these are timeless problems. And in fact, I would say in closing here, if you want to look at some of the examples, I would say that we have with the idea of what he thinks is the true cause of Sparta and Athens coming to blows is very reminiscent, and many have pointed this out. I'm not an originator here, to how America and China and the likes of BRICS and NATO are handling themselves on the international stage. Will it be just one territory? Is it something like Ukraine or China's interest in Taiwan? That seems somewhat incidental to the greater issue at hand, which is that China is a very powerful land power. And I have a very old video about America's ambitions as the great sea power is to always level off the great land power, because in that case there a great land power can perhaps stop the sea routes. And so if that happens, then America is in trouble, and vice versa. If you have sea domination, then you can also squeeze and use those tactics towards embargoes and the likes like that. And so it does seem like there is an inevitability as China continues to close the gap, if you will, between America and the international influence here, that it doesn't really matter what necessarily the one reason that we're going to get perhaps in the next century or so for what could cause this next conflict, but it will have much more to do with exerting power on the international level between the number one and number two superpower. And of course that remains to be seen. I don't want to say that this is with certainty, but that does seem to be the direction, in the same way that Sparta and Athens have in this war. And the other example perhaps is the revolution in Corcyra, where there is no moderates anymore. Everyone had to choose a sign, and in a lot of ways it seems to be, at least in America at the moment, you very much only seem to have the choice between the left and the right. In fact, it's especially if you look at the sort of third-party startups that continue to try to gain ground in America. It doesn't seem like they're going to make much ground, but they're simply shamed for not aligning with whatever particular party or a great tent umbrella, if you will, that they fall under, are more likely to be shamed for that than perhaps trying to, bring about a new political reformation or some fresh ideas to the table. And so we're seeing very much that loss of moderation, and that too remains to be seen on, what is to happen with that situation in America, and not just in America, but I think it's true for around the world, because of course America's influence, really, there are political elections, of course, have international ramifications, and with the use of social media now, you see kind of the same problems and even the same sloganeering that now does not care for borders. You have nationalist movements across the world for using the same slogans like "Make Australia Great Again" and "Make Britain Great Again." They kind of take that same format now, and so that remains to be seen on what perhaps could happen out of that. But yes, Thucydides here, I think he very much achieves what he set out to do and died for, because this is an incomplete work, actually. He dies before he even finishes it, and he gives us a timeless idea and a social science to really build out of and influence out of towards these timeless problems and circumstances that causes roughly the same reactions. And I think that's very true. And so I hope you guys enjoy this video, and like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you for, I think, the start really of an introduction to the pre-Socratic philosophers in a whole.